Um, okay. I don't know. I think I have a recording. If not, Corey's just gonna miss out. All right. So, of course, like in every one chapter, they have these focus questions they want you to think about as we go through here. And so, the four questions they have this time are: where and what did the American expansion affect Western Indians before the mid 19th century? So, we're going to focus a lot on that. Um, what factors determined the defeat of the Plains Indians in their war against the United States? Why did the United States relocate and confine Indians to reservations? And how did different tribes and different individuals at different times respond to American expansion and colonialism? Those It's a really big, detailed question, but we're gonna break those down as we go through here. Um, as you look in the book on the first part of the chapter, there, they have the timeline that they usually do in every chapter. There are some really important events that happen in this chapter to Native American history and American history um, that really define um, the relationship that American Indians and Native Americans, whatever term you want to use, relationship with the United States going forward and in today in the modern era explains a lot of the mistrust that is placed there, how in how we treat our sovereignty is definitely the most important part to us actually being a tribe. Um, so when after the Louisiana Purchase, and as we get into about the 1840s, the United States, um, as a brand new nation, are growing in people and citizenship. The numbers are growing. They need more land, and it was we seen that in the last chapter is they're running out of space. And so as they need more space, they're going to take more land and start moving west. At this time, they're still not much further than the Appalachian Mountains, but they start moving further and further west. They start to finally cross the Mississippi, especially after Louisiana Purchase. So we see this term come up again that was used back when the first colonizers came, especially from England, and made their way on the East Coast. There, as we see this term manifest destiny, and so this was a creed that the American people adopted, which they took from their colonial roots. That pretty much says God gave them the right to occupy all the land, especially applying it to the actual continent, all the land to the west and extend the blessing of the American sovereignty. So they claim that God blessed them with this, and this is what they were doing. And so, as we've talked previously in other parts, this is a way for them to justify the actions that they've done and the actions they're about to carry out. So they don't feel guilty for what they've done because, we look again and they don't see um, the Indians as actual people because they're not quote unquote civilized, or they are just seen on the same level. Because as we know, looking through American history, most domineering type of citizen is a white male, and then even that comes along with just being white and having that privilege. And if you own land and stack up each other, or no matter how much land is owned or um, how much property you may have, if you aren't initially that color skin, you aren't seen as civilized. They use that to push their agenda out west. There's people already living there, as we know, many tribes that exist beyond the Mississippi, all the way out to the west coast already, and they don't care that people are already living there because if they're not civilized, if they aren't recognized as people, they're not really living or they're not really there. They're just occupying the space. Um, as we see back looking at popular American media, the westerns and then the movies that tie into this era of time, it's popularized as winning the West. And so essentially that takes apart the actual tragedy that happened in eliminating the people that were already there, that they were seen as combatants or they were seen as huge opponents that they had to conquer and they had to kill to take the land. And that's not really how it went. So most of the time, the people who were there were pushed aside. However, um, they did not see the West as they seen the West as being lost and not won. So when the Indians looked at it from there, when the Americans started to encroach on their land and started to take it by force, and there's little to anything they could do about it, they did not see this as they were losing their land or they were losing the West. Americans then and since depicted the Indian resistance as a futile effort to step the tide of civilization and hold back. So the American viewed the Indians, of course, so we talked about they are not civilized. They are able to keep up with the Americans. First of all, most Americans, at least didn't trade with Americans, didn't see Americans as having the capability to be great thinkers or to have strategy. And so they thought that, they could just come overpower us and it'd be done. But when we did fight back, they seen it as a useless effort, that we were just wasting our chances to fight back, because no matter what, the Americans are going to win. And even though that may be the case, there's definitely some instances that we'll look at through here that what they took for not giving us a serious chance, they paid for in death in losing certain battles. So at this time, remember, we have Coronado's Spaniards who have invaded through New Mexico and made their way up into the Great Plains, which have a lot of those cultures that are integrating with the Spanish. We start seeing some of those first mixes of Indians and Europeans through the Spanish. As we remember back to when we talked about focused on Spanish, those cultures at first very rough to each other, bumping heads. But as time went on, they were able to find like a common ground to work on, and most of that amounted to the Indians there giving in to the Catholic side of the Spanish inquiries and feeding that part of their superiority, and would eventually land to the blending of cultures and marriages and the children that would come out of that. And so we have those that they had the Spanish that come in around the 1540s, and then around the 18th century we start having other European traders come into the area in the Great Plains and throughout some of the West. And then in the 19th century we finally start to see American explorers that start penetrating the West in small numbers. The first invaders to come from the east in force were actually Indians. So when we look at this, as the Americans start to push westward, they're all coming from one area, which is the East Coast, where the original colonies were. As they're pushing westward, where the Indians are having to move from their land, and so the actual first invaders into the West are actually the Eastern Indians. And so that, of course, comes with, in the 1830s when we have Indian removal, which sends Indians to Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kansas, and Missouri before they all get wrangled into Oklahoma, or what would be later known as Oklahoma. Some of the Southern Plains Indians that were on the far east of it actually had to resist invasion from a lot of the five civilized tribes that were trying to make a homestead in their plains area. And of course, the Southern Plains Indians, most of those Indians out there were fierce warriors and were very fierce on the back of a horse. And so there was just no competition. And eventually, the five civilized tribes exit that area and start, making our homestead and actual what comes to be Oklahoma. Um, as we know, smallpox becomes just a devastation to most Indian populations. This makes the West no exception to that. The West faces that at a later time than a lot of the other Indian populations did, just because of the exposure that they did have at the time. They were very late in the game when they were exposed to it, and by the time they were, um, it was a very bad time for it to happen, like any other time. But it did eliminate a lot of their numbers, like it did in other nations. So as we move into around 1840 and going on, we start to have the establishment of Texas. And so Texas is established as the Republic. It's known as the Republic of Texas. It's actually their official name, even though they're part of the Union now. Originally, that wasn't always the case. And so they actually, instead of having governors to start out with, they actually started out with presidents. And so the first president of Texas is Sam Houston. And Sam Houston took the position that it would be a good idea to have a peace with the tribes, to have a certain trade going on with them, to work within them, because Texas had a lot of Indians that were natural to the area. And so he thought the best course of action was to have peace with them and to work with them. When he's out of being president, the second president comes in, and his name is Meriu Lamar. He changes the position and starts to go more to a Jacksonian idea, in the instance that his policy of dealing with the Indians was a policy of ethnic cleansing. And basically, he wanted to get rid of all Indians in Texas. And so the book goes into a lot more detail than that. The basic what I'm going to tell you there is he did not want to deal with Indians in Texas. Uh, this also uh, this also lends to, when he moves all these Indians out of Texas, he's going to end up dealing with um, huge raids as Texas expansion happens and people start to settle in Texas. He's going to start dealing with huge raids that come in from other Indian tribes, mainly the Comanche. The Comanches are going to use Texas as a huge playground. And the Comanches will raid from Kansas. That's where they were kind of about, was northern Oklahoma, Kansas, and some of Colorado, in a yeah, in a big circle, kind of where they roamed. They would go all the way down to the southern coast and raid all there. There's lots of historical accounts between the Comanche and the Texas Rangers when they're established. There's a term that is used to define these battles that happen. They're called running battles, and essentially these are battles that happen on horseback across hundreds of miles. It's said that when the Comanches would raid down, and even in Texas, and the Rangers would catch them and they would chase them out, the Comanche would leave a trail of treasure as they would go back to their homestead. I mean, you could almost find the trail of stuff that they fell off their horses because they were running so fast. They weren't able to keep it all on pack. So there's a lot of stories in there, but the book does go into more detail on that. I'm just going to barely touch on that. And then so moving into 1848, we had the discovery of gold in California. So as we know, um, most European society and American early society is driven by money, power, property. Those are kind of the main three parts that American society runs off of. And so when the discovery of gold happens, this starts the initial push for everybody to move westward. And so the Indian populations that were in California, that were initially, almost untouchable at the time, because not many had made it out to California. The most they dealt with is some Spaniards, and then we know that the Russians had come in at some point and traded a little bit, but the Russians didn't really make it too much into California. Most of it was in Alaska and some up in Washington, and so when people start to come out for this gold rush, the Indian population, like most populations with first European contact, is devastated. Uh, they lose up to, well, at the time there was at least 300,000 that lived in the area, and by the time contact happens, they lose about half. So about half die in these conflicts that happen for these gold rushes. And so they were devastated by a couple of different things. Of course, disease, starvation, slave labor. And so moving to the 1850s, we have the United States start to create a series of reservations. These reservations are not our early set reservations in the mindset that they are not what we tend to know as reservations, especially nowhere near what we know reservations as today, but they are more like refugee camps. And so there's not a ton of popular documentation on this, but the idea is they're pretty similar to what would happen roughly 100 years later when World War II happens, and they take in the Germans in America and any Japanese, and they confine them to those refugee camps. That was kind of the idea of how that worked. They were kind of like prisoners, and so we start to have that happen. Um, we start to have the California Indians facing the same problem the Indians did on the East Coast, and most Indian nations are facing at the time is they're struggling to keep their land. So California Indians start to try to seek help through the U.S. government. They start to try to use those proper channels, kind of similar to how the Cherokees did. And as they try to seek that relief through the government, through the court system, it fails because they have no legal standing in the U.S. government. Um, so moving on, we're going to shift back to the plains a little bit. And so we know the Plains Indians are usually the ones that are conveyed in popular Hollywood movies and stories because they are just the perfect placement for those movies. They just seem to fit them better than the typical ride on the horse. You have all the regalia, and they look like warriors. What the Indian warriors, and so most like John Wayne movies and stuff about moving west, or families moving, and they have those wagon trains, and the Indians raid the wagon trains and burn them down and raid everything. That's another popular misconception of what actually happened. So what actually happened is most of the time those wagon trains got through pretty peacefully. Um, Most time what happened is you had Indians come in and would guide these people on a safe path or help them across the rivers, or would come and trade with them. Pretty normal stuff is what we see in Indian European um relationships. And so when we look at number wise, there was about 250,000 that migrated across the Great Plains between 1840 and 1860. Out of those 250,000 people, only 362 died. And that's not necessarily they died because of a conflict with Indian raiders or anything. It's just we know that they died. Um, and of course, some of those probably were conflicts. I mean, not everything was peaceful. There was things that happened that obviously were conflicts, and people didn't agree on things and different things like that. But um, so, of course, during that time and leading up to that, tensions were rising between Indian nations and Europeans and the Americans, and um, it was just like if you did the wrong thing, there was going to be held, and so this was unavoidable. And so we know that most of the Indians had a expectation that when you did trade with them or you came into their area, you wanted to pass through, you had to pay some sort of tribute. And so when that tribute wasn't paid, or maybe the person didn't know, some people did trade with this, would bring up that tension. And so the Indians, of course, didn't think that they had the right to move through. And so if you pay this tribute, yeah, you can go through. We might even protect you on the way. But if you're not going to pay it, maybe we don't let you through. And so this leads to a lot of skirmishes and battles that happen. And so this starts to lead into wars and treaties between the Indians and the Americans. Between eight, and so we have Americans that believe that winning the West. This is the attitude that happens post Civil War. That the Americans believe that winning the West would heal the wound from the Civil War, and so they believe that if we conquer these Indians, we gain all this land, and we settle it, and people, we have all this power out here. That the wounds from the Civil War that tore the nation apart would bring it back together. And so, one good thing that came from the Civil War was that the Civil War slowed down migration to the West. It gave the Indians that didn't end up being put into the Civil War, it gave them a chance to rebuild and probably strategize a little bit. But we know that at least 20,000 Indians the Civil War were enlisted on both sides. Probably were forced to be a part of that, and probably lied to and promised that, hey, if you come fight in our war here, then we'll give you your land, or we'll leave your land alone, or something like that. And of course, most of the time those promises and lies never came through. They still ended up taking what they wanted. So here are some notable events that happened during the Civil War that affect the Indian nation and populace. So one of the first things that we have happen is we have Stan Wadey, and he was a notable Cherokee, but he was kind of like the bad guy in the Cherokee Nation. And he wanted to be in power, but he could never get the people behind him enough. He had his own group of followers, but didn't have enough in the power to actually take over in the Cherokee Nation. So this was during the time that Chief John Ross was the chief and had power in the Cherokee Nation. And leaving their homelands and coming to Oklahoma, they split into two factions, and there was one faction that followed Stan Wadey and one faction that followed John Ross. And so Stan Wadey, on behalf of the Cherokee Nation, ends up signing the Treaty of New Echota, and promptly he was assassinated afterwards. There is a lot more detailed story than that. That he's kind of warned not to do this, and if you do this, we're going to kill you, and we'll cut your head off, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And it's not a good thing. Also, Stan Wadey was a very notable and was very participating with the South during the Civil War to also gain power in the Cherokee Nation, what he thought would be a good way to gain power in the Cherokee Nation. And I don't know if you ever heard this, but he's known for burning down Tahlequah after it was first established. He actually participated with his followers in burning down Tahlequah. That's kind of the story about him. And so next we have Little Crow, and the Americans at this time, they'd made kind of a deal with them, and were pretty much going to help them live, because at this time, as Americans approaching, some of the normal dietary needs that these people had in the plains that were met by normal hunting and standards as the Americans came through made that really hard. So for peace, they made a deal that the Americans would help them survive. When the Americans don't follow through, Little Crow's people, they're Dakotas. Once they didn't follow through, they were upset. Little Crow had a bunch of warriors that were upset about this. But Little Crow's trying to speak to them and say, hey, you know, you don't want to do this. This is not smart. Because he said that Americans were as thick as locusts and flies. Count your fingers all day long, and white men with guns will come faster than you can count. And so he's trying to tell them, like, we're outnumbered, this isn't going to work. But they're so mad they can't see, right in front of them. And so they end up killing more than 1,000 settlers in this upset um, act of just revenge. And so this leads to the Great Sioux Uprising, because the Sioux also um, are heavily guarded by the military and, kind of put into a reservation-like situation, and they weren't getting the rations like they were supposed to. And so what ends up happening is they retaliate. So what ends up happening is about 1,700 Sioux were gathered in Fort Snelling, and they were confined in wooden stockades. And so we had about 1,100 Indians that were put on trial for murder because of what happened with the being upset about the deal that happened. It fell through. And what that ends up leading to is there were 38 Indians that were executed at Manikato in the largest public hanging in American history. And so there was 38 of them, from stories that I've read, 38 of them hung at one time. And it was a travesty because, I mean, it was unfair that they were treated that way, but they were still put on trial as if they just acted out of pure evil intent. And that ends up going into what we have as two of the worst massacres that happened during the Civil War. And so the first one in January 1863, we have Colonel Patrick and a force of California volunteers. They went after a Shoshone Bangkok village and just massacred the people that were there. Mostly women and children, some men, and they eliminated them. It ended up killing something like 200 men, women, and children. And this was, I believe, in Bear River, Idaho. And then the next thing that would happen is in the next year, we would have the Sand Creek Massacre. That Sand Creek Massacre, because the Cheyenne and Arapaho that were there under Chief Black Kettle were supposed to be under protection of the U.S. government. They had made deals and were supposed to be there, and they were where they were supposed to be, following what they were supposed to be. But you had this Colonel J.M. Shilverton, and he was the leader of the 3rd Cavalry. They come in and literally just, for lack of a better word, just eliminate them. And even while this was happening, Black Kettle raised an American flag and a white flag, but the soldiers still came through, and they butchered somewhere like 270 people, which were mostly women and children. Now, so this happened pretty close to far out western Oklahoma. Um, if you've never been out there, the Cheyenne and Arapaho, when you get out into their territory out there, they actually, I think in the last 5-6 years, they built a museum out there, and they actually have where you can go out where some of the battle happened. And it's a very sad and solemn place, but it's a great thing to learn about and to actually see where this happened. But yeah, it's one of the terriblest massacres that happened in American history, and especially up to this point. So after this happens, of course, word starts to spread across the plains. Indian warriors were seeing the writing on the wall, seeing what was going to happen, seeing that they had to fight, and so they retaliated and they set war on the settlers. And this was a problem that the settlers had thought about. Like, we don't want this to happen. We want to try to eliminate this from happening. But, when people have actions that carry out like that, there's going to be retaliation. And so we start seeing notable battles that happen, such as Ulaga Chief Red Cloud in his fight with the U.S. Army. He fought them to a standstill in 1866 and 67. This comes to establish the Indian Peace Commission in 1867. And so their job was to make peace with the Indian nations, to stop fighting, to prevent future conflicts, confining Indians to reservations where they could be segregated, supervised, and educated in civilized ways. So we start to see that doctrine of kill the Indian and save the man right in that commission's startup. And so um, when this happens, when this idea is setting out and they're starting to try to delegate with Indians, they still do not see Indians as separate nations. What they see is people who look the same, who are spread out over a distance, so they must all be the same. So if something was to happen, down in Texas with some Indians, the Indians up in the north were just as much blame because they're the same people. That's how they viewed it. And so when we look at treaties that happen during the United States, interesting thing that happens is the Senate of Congress, the Senate is the only ones that were able to deal with Indian nations and write treaties and approve treaties. The House of Representatives were left out of this process, which left the Senate in charge. But in 1871, Congress declared there was an end to making treaties, so they stopped making treaties completely. And so they wanted to still work with tribes, and so how working with tribes dealt with after that, when there was no more treaties, is they still made agreements. They made statutes or laws, and the president would make executive orders to deal with Indian nations. And that's still an act today, is how they deal with the Indian nations. So in 1869, we see the first transcontinental railroad being finished, which means it goes from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. And so this starts to truly affect the diet of the Plains Indians, where they had been able to survive off the wildlife there, the buffalo. When we start having significant traffic come from the Americans to come over there, buffalo were starting to be hunted. We're starting to see over hunting happening, and so the buffalo population goes down. There's no chance for them to keep population counts up, and so the buffaloes start to die down and become extinct. Um, and so this, starts to bring a lot of uprising in those Plains Indians, because when food gets scarce, you know that you're only steps away from being hated, and so you really got to fight for your life, not only your land but your life and your people. And to see these huge uprisings happening, and so which leads to January 31st, 1876. The United States would launch a three-pronged pacification campaign against the hostiles who refused to come in, which would be these Plains Indians, the mainland of the Lakota Sioux, the all those Plains tribes that banded with them up there. And so, of course, this leads to the story of crazy warriors. And so, of course, he was a fierce warrior, a really great war chief and strategizer, and he was able to defeat one prong by himself and his band of Indians, General Crook, at the Battle of Rosebud in South Dakota. 1 week later, Custer to the 7th Cavalry approached from the east and found Little Bighorn and rashly attacked. And so, as we know, there Custer was defeated again. And so during this time, I'm gonna butcher this Chief Sitting Bull's band, but the hunk of Popeye. He had a vision, and so he was a very visionary leader. But he had a vision that soldiers without ears, indicating that they refused to listen, would come following up, and that's what happened. His vision came true when these soldiers came into to camp. they were not listening. They were just attacking, just pure rage. And even though that they would win that battle, Little Bighorn, it ends up becoming a massacre. It ends up killing, crazy amounts. And so this leads to Crazy Horse surrendering. Their people end up moving to a reservation. Sitting Bull would flee to Canada at this time. And so that kind of puts a piece to the Plains at the time. And then we have in 1877, Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce of Oregon. They would make a 1,500-mile bid for freedom trying to reach Canada rather than go to a reservation. They defeated and looted various American Army battalions that were sent in pursuit of them, but they were caught just shy of the Canada border and were exiled to Indian Territory. And so that leads into Indian Territory being kind of like a huge reservation slash, essentially a prison for Indians. And so there are some more battles that do happen in there that I'm not going to cover for the sake of time in here. The last section of this chapter deals with the Apaches, and so this is going to deal with a lot of Geronimo's battle with the U.S. Army, and I'm just going to briefly cover that. More detail is going to be in the book, but Geronimo had his own band of Apache that followed him because they believed in him. Geronimo, of course, wasn't much of a leader until the Spanish came up and actually killed his wife and child, and this led him into a place to find Solomon and the Great Spirit, and the Great Spirit showed him a vision, and he believed that he was going to be untouched in battle, that bullets would fly past him, that he would never be hit, and lead him to fight the U.S. Army and the Spanish, and that he would eventually be able to establish the Apache homeland again. And so there's many times that he battles the U.S. Army, fights them off, is able to survive, his people survive, but not all the Apache are lucky like that. And so a lot of the other parts of the tribe get punished for his actions. Eventually comes to a point where the leaders of the bigger Apache band come to him and say, hey, it's time to give it up. You're hurting our people. And Geronimo's not wanting to do that. And Geronimo fights down to the last bit to where there is no more left to fight. He ends up being going from being a hero of his tribe to being a villain, essentially. They end up having to surrender. When they do surrender, the U.S. Army gets them, captures them, takes the whole Apache tribe, puts them on a train. I believe they go to Florida and are segregated there in Florida for a little bit before they return to Indian Territory. Geronimo ends up being a special prisoner, and I think he ends up being gets kind of imprisoned at Fort Sill. And later would kind of become, let me say this. So the Apache would become the last ventures of the Indian Wars. And so once the Indian Wars were done, we move past 5-10 years after that. We start looking at the Indian Wars. American people start looking at the Indian Wars. This is nostalgia. These Indians, these braves. And so Geronimo was kind of like the last living hero of the West, kind of. And so they look at him as this character that survived this time, and he becomes kind of a mascot for it, and is part of like Wild West Bill's show, and is making appearances. But after this, he becomes accounts talking to him about being a drunk, of course, being unhappy with himself, and he ends up falling off of a horse riding a drunk and breaks his hip, I think, and catches pneumonia, and he ends up dying because of that. So he lives out a very sad rest of his life. Um, the last part of this chapter deals with different strategies for survival. So you'll want to take a look at that, but that's just showing that not all the Indians survived the same way. Not everybody decided to fight. Some, of course, tried to delegate. Some tried to enter into American society and to become a part of it. Some secluded themselves entirely and tried to go away. Some just tried to be as peaceful as possible and tried to keep their people the safest possible. And so there's different ways that each tribe survived. And so that talks a little bit about that. And then the next session talks about Indian scouts and allies. So we've talked about this before, but we know that there was Indians that would scout for different traders coming through, or even different American groups or the military would scout for them sometimes. And sometimes that would be forced and sometimes it wouldn't. It kind of depends on tribe to tribe and who it was and why it was. But there was definitely lots of help that came from Indians scouting for the various different groups that came through, both harmful and helpful in many situations. And then the last thing we're going to cover before we end out here, and you'll need to read this in detail, but we start having the return of the prophets. So after all this battle's done, after all this war's done, after everybody's kind of been moved to these reservations, we start seeing the revitalization of the old ways, the old religion, and we start trying to see them revive how they used to do this. And of course, what comes out of this is a lot of the Plains tribes and the tribes that have these sacred dances. They revitalize something and call it the ghost dance. And the ghost dance is supposed to bring that warrior spirit and bring back ways of old to empower their people. And this ends up not setting well with the Americans. It ends up becoming a real problem for the Indian people. And not just that, of course, the five civilized tribes had their thing as well, as we try to keep up our stock grounds and our old ways of doing things. That was very opposition to what the Americans wanted for us. And so that would lead to punishment for doing pretty much anything that wasn't necessarily Christian or didn't look Christian. And so this ends up leading to, pretty much if you're caught doing it, there's punishment that follows. And a lot of times it was either death or starvation or something terrible. And I want to say this ends up leading to a restrictive act that is happening, and it's like the net 1970s that we'll cover, where there's an actual act in Congress that happens to give Native Americans, the freedom of religion again. And so it's a terrible thing. So you'll want to read over that to know about that. I do not have. When I get back to the office, I will hopefully have slides to put up. They're all on my computer in the office, and I don't have access to that. So I should have some stuff for that, as well as going forward with the test or anything. That'll all be back when we get back to the actual building. So hopefully beginning of next week. I do not have anything here at home. So pretty much like we did in the last chapter, I'm going to allow y'all to pick one of these readings here in the back and just read one of them just for enrichment. And then on Wednesday, I will post probably a little longer discussion question than usual. And unless y'all need to, we won't meet on Wednesday. You'll just be required to do that discussion post on Wednesday, and that'll count as your attendance for class. Sound good?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. You have any questions or anything? Comments?
Not really. Quite. Not much.
Okay. Well, go ahead. If you have any questions, nothing. If you don't want to ask them now, you got my email, or I'm sure you can post something through D2L, or even send it on here. But I'll get it some way. But if you need some clarification on something or anything, let me know, and we can work around to find a answer for that. All right.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. If you don't have anything, that's where I'm going to end it, and look for that discussion post on Wednesday, and hopefully see you in class on next Monday.
Yes, indeed.
All right. Stay safe and warm.
All right. You
All
too.
right. Bye.
Bye.